Welcome to Resistance, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans, and Two-Spirit Relatives. I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. I am currently presenting to you from occupied Massachusetts land in so-called Cambridge, Massachusetts. Within Native communities, land acknowledgements are a common practice. We often begin meetings, gatherings, and events by acknowledging and thanking the host nation whose land we're on, much as you might thank an individual or organization, such as Teach About Women, who has hosted an event. More recently, however, land acknowledgements have become commonplace in non-Native or settler society as well. These land acknowledgements have a slightly different tone and purpose, often being delivered to acknowledge the ongoing occupation and colonization of Native lands by non-Native peoples. Although land acknowledgements in and of themselves are not enough to repair the harms of ongoing occupation and colonization, they are an important first step in the right direction. So, before we move on, please answer this question for yourself. Whose land are you on? I urge you to pause the video here and visit the website native-lands.ca as it appears on the slide. This website provides a map which will allow you to identify the Native nations whose land you're currently occupying. I'll give you a minute now to do that. Thank you for taking the time to acknowledge whose land you're on. When using this lesson with students, please also be sure to include a land acknowledgement. Give students time to explore this website and ask questions if land acknowledgements are not a common or explained part of your school community's practice at this time. Now for our objectives and agenda. Today's presentation has three main objectives. The first is to develop a deeper understanding of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people, which you may see me abbreviate as MMIWGT2S. The second objective is to explore how Native people have resisted MMIWGT2S through data activism, artivism, and organizing. Finally, the third objective is to take away resources and materials that can be used in or modified to fit your classroom as early as this spring semester. As for our agenda, I'll begin with an introduction of myself and my connection to this topic. I will then review some terminology that will come up in the presentation. I'll do a brief content warning before diving into the background of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people crisis. Then we will walk through 3 activities that you can use with students about data activism, artivism, and organizing. At the end of the presentation, I will share some brief ideas for engaged or hands-on assessments before closing out. So to introduce myself, my name is Kemiyawi or Kemi Wapipa. I identify as a multiracial Native American person. I am enrolled in the Kickapoo tribe of Oklahoma, and I also identify as Sac and Fox and white. I grew up urban in the Bay Area of California, where I would often accompany my dad on his classroom presentations, where he attempted to dispel the myths about Native people that are too often perpetuated in America's schools. It was these experiences, in part, that eventually inspired me to become a teacher. Between 2009 and 2020, I taught English, history, and social studies at charter and private schools in the Boston and New York City areas. Recently, I have returned to the classroom as a student myself in order to pursue a PhD in education at Harvard University. I must be clear that I do not come to today's presentation neutrally. As a Native person, the MMIWGT2S movement feels both close and urgent. I firmly believe that we, as Native women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people must be seen, heard, respected, and afforded the same opportunities as other human beings to live and thrive on this earth. This presentation is rooted in that belief. So let's go over some terminology. The first thing I want to address is what to call Native people. Throughout this presentation, you'll hear me use the terms Native, Native American, American Indian, and Indian interchangeably. Technically, all of these terms are correct, but different terms have fallen in and out of favor throughout the years. So I would say that currently Native is probably the most widely acceptable term that non-Native people can use to refer to the Indigenous people of North America. However, a best practice is always simply to ask people what they prefer, especially if you have Native members of your classroom or school community. Also, another best practice is that when possible, you should try to use specific tribal names. So for example, I prefer to be referred to as Kickapoo when people know that about me, rather than just generally Native American. Another term you'll see throughout this presentation is women, spelled with an X. This term is intentionally misspelled in order to be broadly inclusive of all women and femme identifying people. You will also hear me use the term two-spirit, which is a pan-Indian term referring to a range of gender identities and sexual orientations that have existed in our cultures since before colonization. Both of these terms acknowledge that the narrow and restrictive definitions of gender and sexuality common in the United States today are neither natural nor normal to the human condition. Furthermore, both of these terms are inclusive of our trans and non-binary relatives, who are all too often left out of the MMI-WGT2S conversation, despite facing even higher rates of violence than cisgender Native women and girls. Finally, you will frequently hear me use terms like relatives and kin to refer to Native people throughout the presentation, regardless of my biological relationship to them. This is a common practice among Native people that acknowledges our interconnectedness and the non-colonial concepts of family and society on which many of us operate. If you identify as a non-Native person, I invite you to use terms like people, folks, or the names of specific tribal nations instead of the term relatives. The final thing we need to do before launching into the presentation is to go over a content warning. So this presentation will address several sensitive issues, including racism, colonialism, sexual violence, and homicide. In other words, this presentation will be heavy. Although graphic images and descriptions will not be used, these topics will be named and acknowledged openly throughout the next hour. Therefore, I encourage you to do whatever it is you need to do to engage in self-care both during and after this presentation. Finally, this is also an important reminder to be thoughtful and intentional about the terminology and content you choose to use with your students. The material discussed here is designed primarily for high school students and is best used in a classroom where a supportive and inclusive community has already been established. As a teacher, you will need to exercise your discretion in order to determine which parts of today's presentation are most appropriate for the students that you teach. So let's dive in. As LaDonna Bravebowl notes here, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people is unfortunately not new. It began along with colonialism over 500 years ago and continues to this day. We don't have time here to delve into all the details of colonialism, but there are a few main points I would like to highlight, summed up in this quote by scholars Ro Bubar and Pamela Thurman. Colonization and historical trauma resulted in the sanctioning of violence against Native people, deterioration of traditional support systems for Native women, adoption of the dominant culture's view of women, resulting in economic deprivation and the impoverishment of tribal communities. There's a lot there, so let's break that down a little bit. Let's start with the phrase, sanctioning of violence against Native people. Since the arrival of Columbus, violence has characterized interactions between white and Native people. We need only look at the undisnified story of Mataoaka, aka Pocahontas, to see a clear but unfortunately not unique example of gendered violence between white colonists and Native women. It is also worth noting that until quite recently, violence against Native people in general and Native women specifically was not only sanctioned, but actually encouraged by both state and federal policy. The next key phrase here is deterioration of traditional support systems. Colonial violence combined with rampant disease completely upended many Native societies starting in the early 1500s. Cultures, economies, and lifeways that had sustained Native people for millennia were disrupted and in some cases became completely unviable. In a quickly shifting sociocultural and economic landscape, therefore, Native women did not always have access to traditional support systems to sustain and protect them. This leads to our next key phrase, which is the adoption of the dominant culture's view of women. It is no secret that the United States has engaged in never-ending efforts to make Native people disappear from this land. Government boarding schools designed to force assimilation into white American culture during the 18 and 1900s were a clear example of this phenomenon. Adhering to strict gender roles was a critical part of the boarding school process. Not only were girls segregated from boys in these schools, they were also forced to dress in particular ways and engage in particular forms of work that emphasized their subordinate and subservient role in US society, often different from their traditional cultural roles in Native societies. This leads to our final point about the economic deprivation and impoverishment of tribal communities. One of the ongoing impacts of colonialism is systemic poverty. Native women must contend with poverty and its consequences at far higher rates than women of other ethnic racial groups in the United States. Limited access to resources and opportunities, combined with other challenges of poverty, make Native women more likely to endure risky living, working, or commuting situations in a society which already targets them for their identity. So, in short, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people is neither new nor random. Rather, it is deeply rooted in the United States' history and present as a colonial entity. So, how does this actually play out in society? In the early 2000s, Bubar and Thurman reported that, according to a report by the Department of Justice, rates of violent victimization were higher for Native women than for all other groups in the United States. Natives are more likely to be victims of crime than are any other groups in the United States. People of a different race committed 70% of violent victimization against Natives. The report also notes that the rate of violent crime experienced by Native women between 1992 and 1996 was nearly 50% higher than that reported by African American males, long known to experience very high rates of violent victimization. According to the Department of Justice, 70% of sexual assaults on Native women are never reported, which suggests that the number of violent victimizations of Native women is actually higher than it appears here. More recent data tells much the same story. In 2018, a landmark report was released by the Urban Indian Health Institute documenting the problem of MMIWG-T2S in urban areas of the United States. Previous scholarship has tended to focus on incidents located within or adjacent to tribal lands or reservations. However, 70% of Native people today live in urban or suburban areas of the United States, making MMIWG-T2S an urgent problem to address in these areas as well. Take a moment now to read over these statistics from the report. As you read, think about what numbers stand out to you and why. Are you surprised by anything you see here? Pause the video now to give yourself time to read and think about these statistics. Thank you for taking the time to process this data. Let's move on. As horrific as the realities of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit crisis are, it is important not to fall into the trap of viewing Native people as helpless victims. We are and have been actively resisting this kind of colonial violence for hundreds of years. Just a few recent examples. The Urban Indian Health Institute, which created the report I just mentioned, is gathering data and resources necessary to address the MMIWG-T2S crisis. The establishment of the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women in November 2019 indicates that the federal government is turning its attention toward addressing the crisis as well. The passage of Savannah's Act by Congress in September 2020 indicates further efforts at the federal government level to direct attention and resources toward missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. Here is an altar dedicated to Savannah Graywind, the woman after whom the bill is named, who went missing from her home in, I believe, North Dakota. These advances are the result of extensive activism and organizing on the part of Native women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. Here you see just one example of this organizing, a photo of a direct action by the Indigenous Kinship Collective, a group of urban Native women and femmes based in Lenapehoking, also known as New York City. Here, they are engaging in a demonstration outside of the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan on May 5th, 2018, the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans, and Two-Spirit People. They wear red, which is a sacred color in many Native cultures and a color which has come to be associated with the awareness-raising movement surrounding MMI-WGT2S. These are, in short, just a handful of examples of the many ways that Native people have resisted the crisis of MMI-WGT2S. We will spend the remainder of today's session exploring some resources which you can use in your own classroom to help students learn more about this resistance. Our first activity will focus on the resistance strategy of data activism. I'll quickly outline what a lesson like this might look like, and then I'll lead you through a part of the activity so you get a feel for how it could go with your students. So first, you can start the lesson by asking students to think about the questions, what is data? Why do we use data, and how can it help us? If students are grasping at straws, you can provide the example of grades, right? Grades are a form of data, sometimes in percentages, sometimes in numbers, sometimes in letters. But these grades are important because they provide us information about how we're doing in a class or on a particular assignment. They help us understand how much we know and how much we don't know yet about a topic, and they can also guide us into making decisions about how to move forward. For example, if I receive a low grade on an assignment, that indicates to me that I might need to set up a meeting with a teacher or spend some extra time studying in order to improve my understanding of that content. If I receive a high grade, however, that affirms that I've been taking the right steps and doing the right things to progress as necessary in school. So allow students to discuss this for a little while, and then transition into the day's lesson by explaining that students will be exploring the data related to an important ongoing crisis in our country: missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people. First, provide some background, like the background I provided you at the beginning of this presentation, either as a part of this lesson or as a part of prior lessons in your class. Then give students the link and have them browse a copy of the Urban Indian Health Institute's 2018 report, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, a snapshot of data from 71 urban cities in the United States. Instruct them to focus particularly on graphics and other text features like the one you see pictured on this slide. And then have them discuss what is one piece of data that stood out to them and why, and what is one question you have about this data and why. When that discussion is finished, conduct a close reading of the final paragraph of the report. During the close reading, you will ask students to read the final paragraph 3 times, each time annotating or jotting notes about something different. The first time, the focus of the reading will be to ask students how or where the paragraph talks about data. The second reading will ask students to focus on strong, negatively charged vocabulary, thinking about what that reveals about the problem of MMI-WGT2S. The third read-through will ask students to focus on strong, positively charged vocabulary and what this reveals about Native resistance to MMI-WGT2S. After each round of reading and annotation, allow students time to write or discuss their answers to these prompts. Let's try this out together on the next slide. So here is the paragraph. You may choose to read this paragraph aloud with your class, but I'll give you a moment right now to read this paragraph through the first time on your own. You may pause the video if you need to. As you read, please note how and where the paragraph talks about data. Great. You should now be finished with your first read through. Maybe you noted the phrases lack of good data and to bring to light the stories of these women through data. Both of these phrases influence the importance of data to the MMI-WGT2S resistance movement. But based on what we've read here, why do you think it is so important to have good data? How does good data actually help resistance? Take a moment to think. You may even want to jot down your reflections. Pause the video if you need to. All right, let's begin our second read through of the paragraph. This time, as you read, take note of strongly negatively charged vocabulary words. I'll give you a moment to do that now. You can pause the video if you need to. You should now be finished with your second read through of the paragraph. As you were reading, you might have noted negative words like appalling, trauma, or phrases like epidemic of violence. This strong negative vocabulary suggests that we should be disgusted by violence against Native women, that it results in intense trauma, and that it is a pervasive and long-lasting phenomenon, right? Think about why the authors might have chosen this kind of language. All right, now we're going to read the paragraph through a third time. This time, you're going to focus on strongly positively charged vocabulary words. Take a minute now to pause the video as you read through. Great, you should be finished with your third read through. As you were reading, you might have noted positive words like resilience, life bearers, reclaiming, and phrases like for Indigenous people, by Indigenous people. These vocabulary words and phrases suggest that Native women are not just victims, but agents who can and should play a key role in resisting colonial violence. Now, as a last challenge, I want you to think about the authors of this report. Who wrote it? And also, who's the audience? Who are they writing for? Would this paragraph be written the same way if it had a different set of authors or a different audience? Take a moment to think. You may even want to jot down your reflections. You can pause the video here if you prefer. In a real class, after that final reflection, students would have a chance to discuss and engage with each other in some way. But for our purposes today, this brings activity number 1 to an end. Let's move on to activity number 2, which focuses on Artivism as a form of resistance to MMIWG T2S. Again, I'll run through a brief outline of how this activity could work in your classroom, and then we'll go through a part of the activity together so you get a sense of how it may unfold with your students. So this lesson should start by thinking about examples of art as social activism. So you may actually want to ask students to bring in an example of a piece of art, including cartoons, memes, GIFs, and so on, that conveys a social or political message. Ideally, this will be a homework assignment so that students come in already prepared to share. But if you don't have time for that, or if you can't assign homework for whatever reason, you may want to choose an example not related to MMIWG2S to share with the class for this activity. Allow students to decipher the meaning of the images before discussing more generally whether or not they think art is an effective form of resistance. All opinions on this topic are totally fine, so long as students are citing examples and providing reasoning and evidence for why they think the way they do. After that general introduction, let students know that they're going to be relating this idea of artivism, or art as activism, to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. As with the previous lesson, you may need to introduce a little bit of background if you've not already done so. After that, you'll move on to a visual analysis of several pre-selected images related to MMIWG-T2S. You will use the See, Think, Wonder format to facilitate student responses. In other words, for each image, you will ask students first what they see, second, what they think it means, and third, one question or wondering they're left with. We'll go over how to do that together on the next slide. Finally, you'll allow students to move into an independent case study of a project called Sing Our Rivers Red. This project is pictured here on the right. As you see, it is a series of single earrings. They have lost their pair. This is an Artivism project that was started by a group of First Nations women in Canada. They got women from all around North America, all around Turtle Island, to mail in and donate single earrings, earrings that had lost their pair. And they requested that these earrings represent someone who was missing and murdered, an Indigenous woman, girl, trans, or two-spirit people who has been a victim of MMIWGT2S. They then displayed these earrings along with information about MMIWGT2S. And this exhibit has traveled around to various community centers, cultural centers, and colleges across the United States and Canada to spread awareness. So students will be provided a couple of resources about this project, including its official website, a newspaper article, and a YouTube clip, all of which will be available on the Teach About Women website. And after students have had a chance to explore on their own, they should come together to discuss the questions: what is the Sing Our Rivers Red exhibit? What do the earrings represent? And is it an effective form of resistance in your opinion? Why or why not? Again, a whole host of answers can be given here as long as students are using evidence from the documents they've reviewed to support their opinions. So let's practice the visual analysis component together. We're going to begin by using this image, which was created by Danielle Fixico and published by the National Indigenous Women's Resources Center. If I were to present this image in class, I would say, we're going to take a really close look at this image today. So on your first look at this image, I just want you to think about what you see. So don't worry about understanding what's going on or what it means. Literally just tell me what you see in front of you. Take a moment now, pause the video if you need to, and jot down a few observations about what you see. Great, thank you for writing down your observations. You may have written things like how you notice that there's a woman's face here in profile. She has brown skin. She has a single tear running down her cheek. She has an eagle feather with the word hope written on it hanging in her hair. There are spatters of blood or some red substance behind her in the background. And there are also words that say things like, no more stolen sisters and make a change. Notice here that I'm really just sticking to what I can see in front of me. I'm not necessarily interpreting what any of this means yet. Okay, so now we're going to look at the image even more closely, and this time I want you to try to interpret it. What do you think this image actually means? What message or point is it trying to get across to us? Take a moment and pause the video here if you need to. Great. So in class, you would then ask students to share some of their interpretations, but I will go ahead and share mine just as an example. When I look at this image, I see a Native woman who is hurting yet hopeful. She has experienced the trauma of seeing her relatives disappear, which is why she has a tear running down her cheek, but she draws strength from her culture, which is represented by the eagle feather that says hope. Great. Now we're going to use our eyes to look at this image one last time. And this time, I want you to think, what is one question left that you have? What is one question that this image brings to mind? Take a moment to think or jot down your question, pausing the video if you need to. Great. And again, if this were in class, I would have students, share the questions that they have. Perhaps they can get into a discussion trying to piece together answers, or perhaps you can just move on depending on how much you want to get through in the lesson. But the idea is that this see, think, and wonder format can be completed for any number of images that you find relatable to this lesson or other lessons. Another image that you might use is this one here from the National Museum of the American Indian. It was a collaboration with a group called the Red Dress Project, who hung red dresses outside of the museum in order to represent Native women's lives who have been lost as a result of MMIWG-T2S. It is part of a much larger project that has taken place across the United States and Canada. The red dress has become a very familiar symbol of MMIWG-T2S to raise awareness about this crisis. Another image that could work well for this activity is this image here of a dress created by a First Nations woman named Agnes Woodward. So this is a very particular type of dress called jingle dress, and in a variety of different Native cultures, the jingle dress is associated with a dance that originally was used as a healing dance. And so the dress itself has also come to represent a kind of healing, and specifically a kind of healing power that women and Two-Spirit people are able to convey. And so here you see that the dress has jingle cones. Those are the little red things hanging from the dress that make a noise when the dancer is wearing the outfit. Those jingle cones are red, again, to represent this sacred color that is associated with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit movement. The words that you see printed on the dress are actually words that were gathered from families who have relatives who are missing or murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, or Two-Spirit people. So you see here phrases like Selena not afraid, found January 20th, deceased in Marina, right? And so there's the idea that, families have actually expressed what they wanted to about their missing loved ones as a part of this dress. So again, this protocol can be used with any photographs, any images that you find relevant to this lesson or to other lessons, so long as you encourage students to take part in the three distinct steps of see, think, and wonder. That brings our second activity to a close. So let's move on to our third activity. So for our third activity, we're going to focus on the resistance strategy of digital and in-person organizing. Again, I'll run through a quick outline of the activity, and then we'll go through one part of it together so you get a sense of how it might unfold in your classroom. So first, start the lesson by asking students to design a social media post to raise an issue about, raise awareness about an issue important to them using pen and paper. So again, they're not actually logging onto social media here, but they're like sketching out Twitter post or an Instagram post or a flyer that they would post online to give a sense of an issue that they are passionate about, whether that's, climate change or MMIWG2ST. After that, you would move on to what's called a social media analysis. So this is a super important activity for learning how to analyze sources and sources that are actually really relevant to youth's lives right now. So first, you would encourage youth to search a social media platform of their choice for the hashtag MMIW, and then find one topic or post that appears to be reliable and another that appears to be a relatively unreliable source of information in their opinion. If you feel uncomfortable letting students have sort of like free reign to search social media, you can also curate and pull a couple of posts that you find to be relevant beforehand to have students analyze together. And then after that, you'll discuss which post did you select as reliable? Why? What did you learn from it? And which post did you select as unreliable and why? And I'll walk through an example of how this discussion could go on the next slide. After that, students will engage in a case study of the Indigenous Kinship Collective, a group of Native women and femmes who engage in both digital and in-person organizing in Lenapehoking or New York City. After exploring the group's official website, Instagram page, and digital photography exhibit, students will engage in a discussion of the questions: what are some specific actions that IKC has taken to resist MMIWG-T2S, both digitally and in person? Ultimately, this discussion can be broadened to consider what are some of the pros and cons of using digital versus in-person organizing in general. Great. So let's take a look at how the social media analysis might work in class. So here I've taken an example of a post that came up just a few hours ago when I searched on Twitter for the hashtag MMIW. So take a moment to look at it carefully and think about, does this seem like a reliable source of information, an unreliable source of information? How do you know? Pause the video here if you need to. Great. So coming together, we might come to the conclusion that this seems like a relatively reliable post, right? It has a quotation from an article, which is linked here. It has an image, an actual photograph. It was posted by an organization with an official name, right? We can't take any of this at face value, but we can easily click on the article or Google the organization to learn more information and see if it comes from reliable sources, right? So it seems like this is an area where we really could learn more about MMIWGT2S. Let's take a look at another example, also pulled from Twitter earlier today. Again, take a moment to look it over and determine if it looks reliable or unreliable as a source of information. Pause the video if you need to. Great. So you may have noticed that unlike the previous tweet, this tweet comes from an unverified individual, and it doesn't contain quotations, it doesn't contain links, it just contains this image. Now, the image is powerful, right? It shows us a reminder that missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people are not just anonymous individuals, right? They're people's mothers, wives, grandmothers, friends, sisters, and daughters. But they also cite a number here that we have no citation for, over 5,700 missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they don't really provide a ton of information beyond sort of this face value reminder. And so this would be a slightly less reliable source of information to use. But to challenge students to go further, you might then ask them to think about, well, is there value in both of these posts? What would be the value of this first source? And what could actually be the value of the second source? Why is it important to have outlets like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok for people to express these feelings? And what might be the downsides of some of that? So again, in class, you could actually give students time to discuss and grapple with these issues. Again, there's no right answer. There are pros and cons, but it's important for students to really start to think critically about how they're using sources of social media as information. So this brings activity 3 to an end. So finally, let's talk about some ideas for assessment. Given that our topic here is resistance, I believe that some form of engaged or quote unquote real world assessment would have the biggest impact on both students and their communities here. Here's a few ideas of what you might do to assess students' learning about MMIWGT2S. First, you might have students create research-based infographics and begin a digital campaign to raise awareness about MMIWGT2S. The Urban Indian Health Institute's report would be a great starting point for students to come up with these research-based infographics. You could also have your class partner with a local organization to provide labor and or resources for gathering data and lobbying for change. So for example, the Urban Indigenous Collective in New York City is just starting an initiative to track data about missing and murdered Indigenous women in New York, which was actually not included in the Urban Indian Health Institute's report because they could not access the data. And so that's an ongoing project where they need people power, right? They might need folks who are willing to contact police departments or to comb databases for information or to conduct interviews or to, write up findings, right? And while they have teams of people already working on this, they might welcome the help of a well-prepared group of students who are capable of spending time on this for free. Another Example of an assessment would be to organize an event, such as a film screening or an art show, that features the work of Native students and adults for the purpose of raising awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. Finally, students could draft proposals to indicate how the school or even the whole city might appropriately acknowledge this year's National Day of Awareness for MMIWGT2S on May 5th, 2021. In fact, students may actually enact these proposals within this school year. So finally, in closing, I did just want to post a picture of amazing, beautiful, and thriving Native women, girls, and femmes. Although missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people is an urgent crisis that must be addressed, we must also remember that Native women, girls, and femmes are resilient and whole beings who are fully capable of agency and resistance in the face of injustice. We hope to move forward with your support. Kepichihi, thank you, and be well all.